Good afternoon and welcome back, everyone. I'm Dawn Howard, Deputy Chair of Ruma, and I'll be chairing the next session. This afternoon, we'll be looking at the international context for the responsible use of animal medicines. And we'll be hearing from four excellent speakers before moving to a live Q&A. So do please keep posting your questions and don't forget to include your name. And I'm very pleased to now hand you over to Dame Sally Davis and Professor Scott Wees. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ruma 2021 conference. I'm Dame Sally Davis. I was the Chief Medical Officer for England and the Senior Advisor to the UK government until the beginning of October 2018, when, with perfect timing, I moved across to be the Master of Trinity College in Cambridge. And I was very honoured that the UK government at that point made me their special envoy in antimicrobial resistance, AMR. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Scott. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Sally. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm coming from Canada. I'm a veterinarian. I'm an internal medicine specialist. And traditionally, I've dealt with antibiotic use and resistance on the clinical side. So myself and with colleagues, and how do we manage animals and manage resistance? More recently, I've had to kind of expand my horizons in the group that Sally's on, the Global Leaders Group, and some other groups looking at the bigger picture. How do we address this problem globally? So for me, I'm trying to figure out how we address it from the patient level and the farm level up to this global issue of antimicrobial resistance. So I'll maybe turn it back to Sally to get us started.
So we are both facilitators for this United Nations Global Leaders Group, Scott leading for animals and me on humans. And we've been looking at what our priorities are. So let's just think about what we can do as a global leaders group. And Scott, do you want to have a go at explaining what we're trying to do?
Well, I think it took me a while to figure out what we were trying to do, because I think a lot of us, our experiences are more of a local level or at a national level, and figuring what we can do internationally and recognize the complexity of the problem. And I think that's one of the big things we can do with antimicrobial use and resistance in general, is just realize the complexity of the problem. And whether that's meaning animals as a broad group, a chicken is different than a dog, is different from a cow, and all the issues that come with that, to the other extreme being, what we can do at a global level is a lot different than what we can do at national and local levels. And really what we're thinking at the global level is, how do we advocate? How do we support? How do we try to get people to have a better ability to enact change themselves or in their region and in their country? The global level can't dictate, but the global level can advocate and provide support for us to make some of the changes we need to change. At least that's kind of my perspective of it.
Absolutely. So I think it's very true. Many of our colleagues arrived thinking they could, I hate this expression, but it's used, pull a lever and AMR would be solved. And we can't. We haven't got a budget. We have no real governance role over and above others, but we are a group that care about it, appointed by the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Organization for Animal Health, OIE, and we have brought in the UN Environment Programme. And the third facilitator for the group, Sunita Narayan, is actually an environmental expert. And so what we're trying to do is work One Health. And you will all know how extraordinarily difficult it is. I think many in the animal field and the food chain area will be used to people from my side of the fence saying, it's all your fault. You use nearly 80% of the antibiotics. Sort yourselves out. I know that the evidence is very limited, that the use in animals at this point causes a lot of ill health in humans, but clearly we have to work with respect. And I wondered whether you'd like to talk to the One Health complexities, Scott.
Well, I think you've got some great issues there. And I think one is the traditional blame approach to antimicrobial resistance. And I'm sure you've been in as many meetings or more than I have, but we have the human side saying, okay, you're overusing antibiotics in agriculture. It's all your fault. And then the agriculture side as well, you're giving antibiotics to every kid with an ear infection. It was a viral infection. It's all your fault. And ultimately, we have to realize that none of us is doing a very good job at it, in the big group. And I can only control what I can control. I can control how I use antibiotics, how I recommend them, how I talk to people about them. I can't directly influence the human medical side. So we have to realize that we each have our individual areas that we can address. And we need to think about the other side. We need to think about the environmental side. As Sally mentioned, there's an environmental component of this that we often completely ignore that might be very important. So I'm not sure I actually answered the question, but from that one health issue, it's the realization that we live in a complex ecosystem. Antimicrobial resistance is an ecological problem, and it's a complex ecological problem, which means it's really going to defy a simple solution. We want, as you said, that magic lever, or if you do this, or this group does this will fix the problem, and we won't. Everyone can do a little bit to contribute a little bit of benefit, but we need everyone to do that for it to work. And that's the One Health approach.
Yes, so I'd often describe it as a very complex jigsaw, and all the little bits will need to be on the picture to actually transform our health systems, our food systems, and as well our environmental systems. I saw one study of 700 samples from waterways, mainly rivers, and over 2/3 had antibiotic contamination because, of course, animals, including the humans, pee and poop it out. So that's really worrying about what's that doing, let alone an area we've been picking up through the G7 presidency of manufacturing of antimicrobials and antibiotics in particular, and how many factories just spew antibiotics out in high volumes and concentration into the water systems. So it is about transforming the systems and sustainability. I mean, I get very worried about AMR because if we don't get on top of it and mitigate it, we're going to lose modern medicine. Antibiotics and anti-infectives underpin not just proper management of HIV, TB, malaria, and other infections, but actually transplants, new joint surgery, cesarean sections, all sorts of things. And I often say to people that climate change matters, but we'll be dead of superbugs before climate change has really started killing vast numbers. How do you describe it, and to try and get people to understand the severity and the complexity?
Well, I think you've outlined a lot of it in the human side. Antibiotics revolutionized medicine, and that applies to veterinary medicine as well. If you think about what we would be doing if we didn't have antibiotics, and what we wouldn't be doing, which is joint replacements, effectively cancer therapy, all these things. If we didn't have antibiotics, we wouldn't have modern medicine as we know it. And if we didn't have antibiotics, we wouldn't have modern agriculture. We wouldn't have modern companion animal medicine as we know it. So we need to figure out how to balance that. We need to use these drugs, but make sure that we continue to use them because, as I said, they're a use it and lose it drug. The more we use them, the more we're going to lose them, the quicker we're going to lose them. And there are all these discussions about the post-antibiotic era. Right? Are we at the, okay, here, eat this root, because that's back to where we are. And, we're not looking at that, but there are enough individuals, and I would include animals and humans in this, that are getting infections now that we can't treat because there's not an effective drug or an effective drug that's safe for that patient. And we see them in animals, we hear about them in people, and this is only going to get worse. Like, this is something that is not going to get better on its own. But maybe as a separate thing, and I don't want to go too long, is you commented on health systems. And I think from us on the animal side, that's got to be the wake-up call. Or it is for me. Like, I've often focused on antibiotic use. How do we use them? How do we use them better? How do we reduce the need to use them? But I think we need to think back even more fundamentally. It's animal health systems. It's human health systems. The better we care for animals, the better we raise animals, the better we can treat them. And the less risk of disease and the less risk of even needing an antibiotic. We don't have to worry about what misuse is or overuse is or what prudent use is, because if they're not sick, we don't need any use. And that's the level we need to be at. We'd have to drop the any use component. We can talk about overuse, we can talk about misuse, but every time an antibiotic goes into an animal or a person and then comes out of them, like you said, and we pee it out or we poop it out and it goes into the environment, we're contributing to this cascade of resistance. So we need to look at the root cause, which is health.
So I think one of the things that brought us all together on the Global Leaders Group, and I was quite excited when I realized, because it was unifying, was how do we prevent infections? So we have a big focus as a group on WASH, sanitation, hygiene, clean water, on prevention through soap and water, through vaccines. I don't know, Scott, whether you know, but I have a bug in my bonnet about fish farming. I've learned to call it aquaculture.
Yeah.
I mean, I have been to fish farms in Hong Kong and in Indonesia, in Asia, where they just tip antibiotics in with the feed and the water is filthy. I've been to fish farms, you didn't know this, in Norway, where they use a mixture of 3 vaccines, and I've even injected the fish myself, and they use next to no antibiotics and protein yields going up. How are we going to get more of this understanding of a need to change our systems to happen in the food system, do you think?
I think you bring in about a half hour worth of conversation right there, because I think it brings in some of the disparity issues too, which would be worth talking about. What we can do in Norway isn't necessarily what we can do everywhere right now. And if you look at antibiotic use in aquaculture, look at some farms in Canada, the systems are set up so they have cameras to watch the food come down because they don't want uneaten food to hit the ground, because that's where the antibiotics exposed. They can't restock the area until they've tested the benthic microbiota there, see if there are antibiotics there, is there resistance there. This is a rich country phenomenon, though, and I think this gets into some broader issues that maybe are beyond this group. But how have we evolved agriculture in the rich countries? Well, we've put a lot of animals in a lot of areas, and we've used a lot of antibiotics, and then we've caught up with vaccination, we've caught up with hygiene, caught up with ventilation. What do we do for the rest of the world that is still trying to catch up with the animal production? Are we going to say, okay, well, no, you can't do what we did because we're doing that with climate change, we're doing that with a lot of other things? No, you have to be like Norway if you're going to farm fish. Or do we say, okay, let's figure out how we can ramp up animal health systems at the same time, so you can increase the number of animals you can produce, but we're not going to have you do it like us. We're going to have you do it better, so that we're improving how you do animal production at the same time. And that's a challenging thing, and it brings in a lot of broader issues. But how in the animal health side do we bring in some of these things? There's not a simple answer, because a chicken is different than a fish and is different than a dairy cow. And it comes down to, if there's education, there's support, there's economics. It has to be economically viable. People have to be motivated to do it. The consumer plays a role in this, in paying for product, but also driving what people want. Again, I don't think I've answered your question really, whatever the initial one was, but I think it highlights the complexity of the issue. Is you can say, okay, we should just do that. And it's easy to say, no, we can't do it because of these 20 things. And I think we often default to that, but we have to identify the barriers to figure out how to fix those barriers. And there are a lot of them.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted to say that I've been educated by our farmers in Britain as to what you can do. And as you probably know, our poultry farmers have reduced antibiotic use by over 90%, and overall we've reduced by over 50%, all voluntarily. So presumably by hygiene. I have visited a couple of pig farms too, hygiene and things like that. And it is impressive. But we shouldn't forget that actually antibiotics are misused in Britain. They're misused across the world. And if you go to some of the middle-income countries, you walk into a hospital, and the minute a patient has been admitted, because they might catch something that would be difficult to treat, they're being given infusions of the latest antibiotics. And it's all complicated by the fact that our antibiotic pipeline is really rather empty. We've got a market failure. And again, we've got G7 working on that. We've, for the first time ever, got the finance ministers working with health ministers on how to pull innovation for new treatments, which can help humans. But then if we get it right, then they will help the animal and food system too. So if you could wave a magic wand, what would you get our group to do?
Well, there are a lot of questions there to unpack. And maybe one thing before that is, like, you talk about the science and the drug development. And for me, one of the biggest barriers to using antimicrobials properly is right here. It's human brain, and it's human behavior more than anything else. And you mentioned the chicken farmers who in Canada, we have a similar situation, did an excellent job reducing antibiotic use, and not necessarily because they fundamentally changed their systems. It's because they realized, okay, we're going to be brave. We're going to bring in some restrictions. We're going to see what happens. We're going to take the first step on that. And I think we've realized that a lot of things that we've done in the past, we've done because we did them, because my father did them, my grandfather did them, and the guy down the road did them, as opposed to things that we really need to do. And again, it comes back to this mental aspect, is we fear change. And we use a lot of antimicrobials. It's been said that antimicrobials are the most, psychoactive drugs that we have, but they act on the prescriber or the user. And I think it's really true, right? Because you get into the mindset. I mean, we'll talk to someone. So dairy calves are a good example. They're babies. They got diarrhea all the time. We don't give human babies antibiotics all the time. Dairy calves get them a lot. And a lot of that's because if you talk to the person that's raising the dairy calves, it's, well, if that calf gets a serious illness and dies, that's my fault because I didn't treat it. If resistance happens, well, I'm not going to see it myself. And, it's the drug's fault, or it's whoever's fault. It's biology's fault. It's the bacteria's fault. It's not my fault. We want to do something. We're conditioned to do something. And that do something isn't always right. So, maybe back to your question, what could we do? Well, we can't really act that much in the human brain. But I think one thing we need to do is try to figure out how we can support the human brain doing this better, right? And that gets in issues of, encouraging action plans and governance, and making it easier for people to do things right, giving them support for doing things right. So at the global level, I think one of the biggest things that we could do is get people to act on the plans that they have sitting there. And Canada is a great example. We have a really good national action plan. We have a really good proposal for a national network group to enact it, and it's sitting on a desk. And it's been sitting on a desk for years. And we have this in various countries. And every country can do more, because every country, there has areas they can improve on. And they usually have, an understanding what that is. So I think one of the biggest things at the advocacy level is, okay, let's act. We know we need to act. We know it's going to cost money. We know it's actually going to save money ultimately, and save lives, and improve food safety, food security, food production, human animal bond, all these other things. So I think for me, if we could get anything, we could get countries to do what they know they need to do, but they've been reluctant to do for one reason or another.
I love that. You've gone at every level, from the individual on the front line through right up to governments. So I suppose I was thinking, if I ask you, I better think, what would I want to waive? And I think it is something about funding. We know we could achieve a lot more in countries if they've got the funding to do it. They could put in place their action plans. We have pretty poor surveillance across the world. We from Britain have the Fleming Fund, 265 million of overseas development assistance, which helps people set up One Health, so animals are in there, laboratories, and do their surveillance. But because I honestly believe that data can drive change, but we've got to get it right at the local level and the national level, and then the global level. And I think funding can make the difference. Funding will make the difference to innovation, and recognizing that we're all in this together has to be one of the things. So we need all these groups, G7, G20, ASEAN, CARICOM, G77, all of them, to push for the funding and push for action. And I think one of the ways that will be helped is when we get this establishment of the promised, I can never remember all the net words, independent panel for evidence on antimicrobial action, or action for antimicrobial resistance, which is supposed to be our equivalent of the IPCC. And we've seen what a difference that can make. So money, action, and the panel to be independent and mark everyone's homework would, I think, be where I'm coming from.
If we have to tie this in this group, sorry.
Go on.
Maybe I'm just going to ask you a question to follow up. If you have to tie this into this group, so we can advocate at the high level, so get G7, get G20, get prominent groups, World Trade Organization saying, okay, we need countries to do this. At the end of the day, politicians are politicians, and you've probably worked them a lot more than I have. But how do we come at it from the other side at the same time? So they're getting pressure from G7, G20, where else that, okay, you need to do something. And they're thinking, okay, what's the impact in country? How do we get groups like this to put this issue on the radar of governments more prominently so they can get up there and say, I'm proud that I'm spending X million dollars on this new initiative versus not having to.
So I think there's civil society and the experts, but one thing I've been working on is with consumer groups. How can we get them to take a role in demanding high quality food, but recognizing, and we're back to your brain and behavior, that most in the global north eat too much animal protein for their physiological needs. So there's how do consumers work? The other area I've been working quite a bit on is investors. We launched an investor action for antimicrobial resistance at the World Economic, whatever they call it, Foundation, WEF, a couple of years ago. And we're slowly acquiring long-term investors, pension funds and people who are interested in adding AMR to their ESG criteria. And interestingly for you, I was facilitating a discussion just before the COP sessions in Glasgow here on universal ownership. And I used AMR as the example, and 3 big Canadian pension funds were here, and they said, they'd start to think about how they, as long-term investors who didn't want to drive externalities and costs that they would eventually pick up, could look at things differently from the investment. So I think it's how do we bring in consumers and investors as well, because, and of course the media, because all of those drive governments in a big way. Together, you and I know we can change the world and we can solve this, but it's a long uphill battle, partly the complexity.
And I think tying it down to the ground level is getting people ready to make change and wanting to. And one of the talking points I have when I talk to veterinarians is, well, I'm in a much better position to figure out how I should use antibiotics than a regulator is. And chicken farmers and chicken veterinarians are in a better spot than someone else. And the more we can work together, or the more we can work proactively, because I think for me, what I'd rather be able to say is, we're good. We're doing all these things. Support us. Let us keep doing all these things. You don't need to worry about us. You don't need to bring in restrictions that may have unintended consequences or don't work. But we need to be able to do this right. So if we're moving ahead already, we can say, okay, support us, help us, do whatever we need to get done, but you don't have to disrupt us. So that's the reason I think we need to be more proactive. Is you can say, leave us alone, or give us money, give us support, but don't you come in and dictate what we're going to do. We should dictate what we're going to do, but to do that, we have to do it right, thinking about the One Health aspects as well. You need to be able to produce animals well, but we need to not mess up antimicrobials in humans. We need to not compromise the environment. We have to figure out that ecological cost-benefit calculus, which is pretty challenging.
What a wonderful spot to finish, because you bring us back to Ruma. Ruma has, of course, led the voluntary work in Britain, and I never thought they could do it. They've done a lot, they're going to do a lot more, and it just shows what can be done. Thank you, Ruma. Thanks, Scott, for joining me on this discussion, and we look forward, both of us, to hearing the feedback from the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you very much to Dame Sally and Professor Wiesen. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could have carried on for quite a while.